Welcome. My name is Judith Kormos, and in this lecture I will discuss issues concerning the assessment of foreign language learners with specific learning differences, including dyslexia. In this lecture, three main topics will be covered: test fairness, the use of accommodations, and considerations in classroom assessment. The American Educational Research Association in 1999 provided general guidelines for ensuring that all the tests that researchers, teachers, and educational authorities administer should be fair. They outlined four main areas in which test fairness needs to be ascertained. The first one, lack of bias, means that the test does not have any components or tasks that give an advantage to certain groups of test takers or disadvantage some other test takers. For example, having to pass a language proficiency test, which is computer administered, might disadvantage candidates who have no or very low computer literacy skills. The second one, equitable treatment in the testing process, means that careful consideration should be given to the context in which assessment takes place and conditions under which candidates can perform according to the best of their knowledge need to be ensured. The third one, fairness as equality in the outcomes of testing, requires that every group of test takers should in theory have equal chances to achieve high scores. Finally, fairness as opportunity to learn means that everybody who is taking the test should have equal chances to prepare for the assessment. If we think about real-life situations and about the case of dyslexic students, it is easy to see that these conditions are not always provided by examination boards or in classroom contexts. An important question to consider when one wants to ensure that test fairness is that how can one balance fairness and so-called construct validity? In other words, what the test wants to test. This is particularly problematic in the case of dyslexic language learners, because proficiency tests measure skills such as reading and spelling that are particularly difficult for dyslexic language learners. But a language proficiency test also needs to have a component that assesses reading and spelling, as these are parts of the construct of proficiency. On the other hand, dyslexia involves reading difficulties by definition. Therefore, the candidate's learning difference should somehow be considered in the assessment. In order to give an answer to this dilemma I have just presented, we need to differentiate accommodations from modifications. Modifications result in a change in the test, how it is administered, how it is completed, and what is the construct being assessed. And this works across the board for all students with equal effect. Accommodations, on the other hand, do not change the nature of the construct being tested. If we want to grant accommodations to students with specific learning differences, including dyslexia, a number of questions need to be considered. Just to list a few. Does the accommodation change the construct being measured? Does the accommodation change the meaning of the scores? Would examinees without learning differences also benefit from the accommodation? When one wants to give an answer to this question, it is important to carefully consider the context. Let's take an example about time extensions. Research suggests that allowing dyslexic students more time to complete a test does not necessarily gain an advantage to students with specific learning differences. For example, the fact that the students have more time to complete a reading test doesn't always mean that dyslexic learners will do better in the test. What happens if we give more time to non-dyslexic students as well? Research evidence shows that allowing extended time in speeded tests might advantage students with no learning difficulties as well. Now let's consider time extensions in summary then. Are they useful? Partly yes, but giving more time to everybody might give all the students more chances to successfully complete the test. What is the conclusion? That the relevance of the time nature of the test to the construct it is supposed to measure should be reconsidered. This leads us to the concept of universal test design, which says that tests should be constructed and administered more flexibly so that accommodations become unnecessary. This is a basic restatement of test fairness. But will this be ever possible? Just think about the practical implications of timed tests. If students are given unlimited time for a test, how could tests be practically administered? Until universal test design is possible, certain accommodations are necessary to help dyslexic students to display the best of their knowledge in language proficiency tests and in classroom assessment. We can give accommodations in the presentation format of the test, such as oral reading, printing the test in larger font size, allowing students to use magnification devices, screen readers in some cases, for example for visually impaired students, and colored overlays might also be helpful. Accommodations in the response format can also be given. These might be allowing students to use a computer to type the answers or to rely on a scribe. Students can respond directly in the test booklet rather than on an answer sheet. Students with attention deficit, for example, often make mistakes when they transfer their answers to the answer sheet, and this helps to avoid this. Students can also use spell checkers in some cases or visual organizers. Accommodations in timing were already discussed. In addition to extended time, we can offer more frequent breaks or tests over multiple days, rather than asking students to take the test in one sitting. Accommodations in setting include individual test administration or providing a separate room for the students. Noise buffers and light adjustment might also be helpful. When we offer accommodations to the students, a number of issues are worth considering. To list just a few again. How do the accommodations influence the validity of the assessment? In other words, am I still testing reading if I allow students to use a screen reader? What are the students' strengths and weaknesses resulting from their learning difference? What kind of learning and instructional strategies work best for the student? Does the student need accommodations at all? And what accommodations increase the student's access to instruction and assessment? Some further questions might be, what accommodations has the student tried in the past and how have they worked for him? What does the student himself or herself prefer? Are there ways to improve students' use of the accommodation? Are there other accommodations that the student should try? Are there ways for the student to practice using accommodations? This is very important. And what are the challenges in providing the selected accommodations and how can they be overcome? This concerns practical test administration issues. The principles of providing accommodations that I have just discussed so far in this lecture also apply to classroom assessment. When teachers administer a test in language classrooms, there are some decisions to be made. For example, what it is that we are assessing. When do we want to test the students, and what kind of test methods and tasks are we going to use? What accommodations and modifications are we going to implement? And after we have administered the test, how are we going to use the test results for evaluation? Are we going to give marks or written or oral feedback? Let's take some of these questions one by one and have a look at how we can assess students with dyslexia fairly. What I'm going to propose here should actually be true in any testing context in general, but is of particular relevance when we work with students who have specific learning difficulties. So when do we assess? It is useful to administer a diagnostic test or do some informal diagnostic assessment at the beginning of the course or module to gain an information about students' strengths and weaknesses. Achievement tests should also be administered at regular intervals so that both the teacher and the student have a clear view of the progress being made and the areas that need to be developed. Continuous assessment, such as classroom observations or portfolios, are less anxiety-provoking than classroom tests and should be considered as alternative means to gain information about students' development. In deciding when assessment will take place during the day or week, it is also very important to take the student's attention level and fatigue into consideration. When we design the assessment task, there are a number of factors that we should consider. First of all, the assessment task should be valid. In other words, it should measure what we intend to measure. For example, if we want to assess students' reading skills, we should not deduct points for incorrect spelling. The task should be enjoyable, motivating, and relevant, and should give students a sense of success rather than a sense of failure. Students with SPLDs usually find it difficult to concentrate on one task for a long time. Therefore, timing issues are particularly relevant. Task instructions should be clear and simple. The difficulty level of the task input, such as that of the reading text, and the difficulty of the response should also be carefully established. We also need to decide whether we will give students any assistance in completing the tasks. With regard to the interpretation of the test results, our marking should be reliable and, if necessary, should take into account the student's learning difference. Students with specific learning difficulties, especially those with attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder, usually prefer quick feedback, and students appreciate if the feedback is detailed rather than simply receiving a mark. Feedback should, of course, be always encouraging, even if it needs to point out some weaknesses. I hope that this lecture will help you assess students with dyslexia and other learning differences, either in high-stakes proficiency exams or in classroom contexts. Thank you for your attention.